Aloha mai kako and ta'alofa lava. My name is Ian Tapu. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am a board member with the Hawaii LGBT Legacy Foundation. And right now you're tuning into one of our Rainbow Town Halls. So we have these every few months as kind of our way to interact with the community, to hear what's important to our community, and to make sure that we celebrate Pride not just in June and not just in October, which is Honolulu Pride, but throughout the year. Because our identities, our community deserves to be celebrated every day. And I want to first welcome and acknowledge our students. The Hawaii LGBT Legacy Foundation partnered with the Lambda Law Students Association at the William S. Richardson School of Law. And I want to thank them. That's Kealapono Richardson, Stephanie Haro-Sevilla, and Daniel Comer for really helping us bring this event together. And of course, you're going to hear from our esteemed guest. With that being said, I'd like to turn the time over to Stephanie. Mahalo.
Thank you, Tapu. Aloha and welcome everyone to our Rainbow Town Hall. We are so excited to have you all here today to listen and engage with our wonderful panelists. We would like to give a special thank you to Tapu and the Hawaii Legacy Foundation for organizing with Lambda and helping just set up this entire event and doing the heavy lifting to make this possible. Tapu is teaching a course at William S. Richardson School of Law this fall, titled Law and LGBTQIA. So please, for all you students, make sure to check that out. And here at Lambda, we just wanted to share we're a 3-person team. We have Kealapono, Daniel, and myself, and we really welcome all students and the community. We're open to all conversations and just really look forward to getting the message out there and working with the community for justice. And before we begin and introduce our panelists, I wanted to turn it over to Kealapono Richardson, one of our leaders here at Lambda, to talk more about Lambda, who we are, and our goal of incorporating mindfulness in all our events.
Aloha, everyone. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, one of our goals at Lambda Law here, which is our student organization at our law school, is to create mindful spaces. And so something that we've been doing for our events is to open them with some kind of mindfulness practice. So I'm going to be offering an opportunity for all of us to practice mindfulness here together. And this means we're going to take a moment before we start to stop anything else that we're doing and just to allow yourself to be fully present in this moment. This is the same exercise that I shared with our Hawaii State Senate. And for those of you that are aware of our state capitol, we have these big chambers that allow for, there's just a really cool space. So this was a practice that I offered to expand the awareness into not only the body, but also into that big room. So today you'll get to be able to practice this not in the chambers, but in the space of your own home or wherever you are. So if you want to practice this with us, or if you want to just listen along, that's also all right. What we'll want to do is just for the next few minutes, we're going to place our attention in different parts of the body and also around your room. And I'm going to call them out. So the job that you have through the next few minutes is just to notice as many physical sensations, whether it's in your body or around the room, as many physical sensations as you can. And part of the exercise will also get to use your imagination. So start, if you're not seated or standing, just in a very comfortable and relaxed place. Allow the spine to be straight. If you're seated, have the feet on the floor. And it's a really good idea to put your hands in an open palm posture. It just communicates to your body and to yourself that you're in a relaxed state. So we'll also want to keep the eyes open and gently focused on a place in front of you. This is just a really interesting technique to do because we want to practice this in your waking life. So keep your eyes open, feet on the ground, and centered. And while your eyes are opened and focused, start to draw your attention in towards your center or your core. In Hawaii, it's the na'au. So this is an area beneath the pico or the belly button, right in your gut or your stomach area. And you're drawing your attention into that center, breathing naturally and relaxed. And there's no need to control the breathing. Just let it go because it knows what to do. And with the eyes gently opened and focused, go ahead and turn the attention inwards again to that center. Notice it. Concentrate your awareness in that area and just notice any physical sensations. As many physical sensations as you can. And if there's any tension in that area, it will flow right out. So just let it go, because we don't need it for today. Then expand your awareness to include your whole body, so that no part of your body is out of your awareness, and you have the awareness all the way from your head down to your toes. And feel the sensations as they come and go through the whole body. If you notice any thoughts or any urges, you can treat them as sensations and just notice how they feel. Now, keeping the eyes focused in front of you gently, move your awareness beyond the body and begin to notice the space around you. You can move beyond your vision and your perception to also include your periphery. You can imagine the space beyond you, beyond the sight, imagining the space behind you, maybe above you or below you. Let your awareness move and expand into the space. Let it get as big as it wants, filling up the entire room with your presence. And notice, how does it feel to be aware of yourself, your body, in your room? Observing and noticing. How does it feel to be here? Now bring your awareness back to your center, your na'au. Rest in that place for a few moments, just noticing how you feel. Are there any changes in your body, in your mind? And beginning to move your arms and your legs around to just get everything working again. You're relaxing your focus to be present, returning to just a natural state of awareness where you're clear and alert, awake. It's important to remember that any time in your day, you can choose to return to center by observing how you feel. It's just what we did today can bring you to your center. And with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for listening or participating in helping us achieve our goal of just incorporating more mindfulness in our day-to-day practice. And I'd like to turn it over to Daniel so that we can continue this panel today with our guests that we have. So thank you for that, and I'll pass it over to my colleague Daniel.
Thank you, Keala. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. First, we have Dee Dangaran. They are a Filipino Black, non-binary, trans femme fairy from Wahiawa, Hawaii. They attended Iliahi Elementary School, Punahou School, Yale College, and Harvard Law School. As a board member of Harvard Law School Lambda, they co-planned a conference entitled Fighting the Carceral State, They were an articles editor on the Harvard Law Review, for which they wrote case comments about restorative justice for sexual assault and healthcare access for trans people in prison, as well as a note on Native Hawaiian land reparations. Dee served as a law clerk on the DC Court of Appeals, and they are currently a law clerk on the US Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Dee recently joined the board of National Trans Bar Association and is currently co-planning the Trans Law Institute, which will be held in July as part of Lavender Law. This fall, they will return to Washington, DC as a movement, lawyering, and litigation fellow at Rights Behind Bars. Thank you, Dee. Next, we have Dean Nicholas Mirkay. Dean Mirkay is currently the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Previously, he was a professor at Creighton University School of Law in Omaha, Nebraska, and a Senior Associate Dean for Administration and Planning. He also served as an Associate Professor of Law at the Delaware Law School of Widener University in Wilmington, Delaware. Dean Mirkay's scholarship is focused predominantly on tax exemption and governance issues regarding nonprofit organizations, with more recent articles addressing state taxation, institutional leadership, and tax systems' contribution to wealth inequality. Dean Mirkay regularly engages in community service, advising and assisting nonprofit organizations on state formation and federal tax exemption. He has served on a number of nonprofit boards, including the Research and Institutional Review Board of the Queens Medical Center, Dignity Rights International, ACLU Nebraska, Food Bank of Delaware, and the United Way of St. Louis. Thank you all so much for joining today. We're going to get started with the questions.
I'll start off with the first question for all of our panelists. Feel free to jump in. And so the first question we have today is, how has your experience differed in the workforce from your experience in law school or a graduate program?
Well, I had a lot of support in law school. I'd say along the lines of personal development, less so than in college, but still very much oriented towards helping us become the lawyers who had kind of holistic views of life. And so through affinity groups and through Dean of Students office events, I gained community based on shared lived experiences along race, class, gender, and sexuality lines. And I had amazing mentors in Harvard's Office of Public Interest Advising. I think it's possible to find community and mentorship after law school, but it's usually not presented to you at like a student org conference in the way that it is, or fair in the way that it is in law school. But sometimes there are conferences such as Lavender Law, which everyone's invited to, that do provide structured networking opportunities as a lawyer. I think that an important part moving forward for me as a young lawyer is being aware that mentorship programs are often geared towards law students, but young lawyers need as much mentorship still as a 3L. There's very little time between a 3L and where I am in my career. And so I think with National Trans Bar Association, for example, even though I'm on the board, I asked the mentorship committee to allow me to be both a mentor and a mentee, kind of be non-binary in terms of that structured relationship as well. We can create the spaces that we need as adults in the law. And so in my internships throughout my career, I was able to find some mentors and worked in places that were LGBT inclusive or actually did LGBT cases. And now I've retained those relationships. So I think it's all about where you put yourself.
Not sure if you wanted me to comment or not, but I've been out of law school for quite some time. So I'm definitely bringing the much more long-term historical perspective, I think, to this panel. So I graduated from law school, I have to say 30 years ago, this May, which is a long time. Things were quite different 30 years ago, and I was in the middle of the country. So that probably should answer the question pretty significantly. I wasn't out in law school and moved to Washington, D.C. right after I took the bar to work for a federal judge for a couple of years, and that's where I came out. Much more supportive environment overall, I'd say. And but I think as we'll discuss in other questions that come up, things were definitely different 30 years ago. And so I would say that I'm definitely going to give you the more emerging evolving story than maybe some. So I'll be inspired by those who are seeing these things much more in the present. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Another question that we have is, in your experiences, have there been any particular roadblocks or setbacks in your professional career because of your LGBTQ identity? And, if so, how can the legal community, I guess, better promote inclusivity and acceptance?
I think this question could take up the entire town hall. I have a lot written down, so cut me off if I'm going on too long. I'll start with the bad. I had a clerkship interview in which the judge asked me, "How may I address you?" And I told him D, and I used they, them pronouns. And he said, I will not be doing that. Asking me to use they, them pronouns is asking me to think too much. This is a judge saying he is being asked to think too much. He added that it would not affect his hiring decision, which would be based on fit and hiring a law clerk that he could trust to do the work. After a lot of turmoil, I decided to withdraw my application. I think something that we have to realize is that the law is the most slow-moving part of society in many ways. It is classist and opaque. Legal services providers are often translating the law for their clients. And I think that it's calling them roadblocks and setbacks is just kind of a piece of the puzzle, because so much of it is internalized in how we approach a conversation or enter a room, enter a space. But occasionally you'll get something as explicit as that comment. I think for responding to something like that extreme, Tapu actually has been involved, and maybe he can share more, in training the judiciary on pronoun usage. And that type of work will go far, because I think practice makes perfect, and people will see that it's not that hard of an ask. I think exposure matters and visibility matters. The legal community can use pronoun name tags at events. You can get fancy and get the ones where it's already printed on, or you can just write it on with a Sharpie. But I think what's really important to say is that it's not just a matter of learning to use they, them pronouns for non-binary people, though that does help. We need to normalize saying everyone's pronouns. A queer cisgender woman friend of mine who was assigned female at birth, identifies as a woman, which makes her cisgender, and identifies as queer, got upset at work because she was singled out and asked her pronouns. She acknowledged that her gender expression is neutral and leans masculine sometimes, but others in the conversation had been using she, her for her already, and she was confused why that context clue didn't tell other people her pronoun. And so I think, and also that person who asked actually kept using they for her after she said her pronoun was she. So it's not just people who use they, them who experience this. We should never assume people's pronouns, and we should normalize asking everyone to share them, because there's no clear way of looking like you use a particular pronoun. And whenever you ask, you should share yours as well. That's just kind of my pronoun explanation. I think that another thing that we can do is stop gendering counsel or law students in the classroom, or even clients. We can use the honorific mix more often in hypotheticals, or you can say friend on the other side or counsel instead of brother or sister, or first names, especially in law school. I think that a big question, a part of this question to me, is who's in your legal community, who ought to be in your legal community. As a movement lawyer, my community must include non-lawyers. One demographic study found that Hawaii has the most trans people per capita of any state in the United States. Trans people should be in more leadership roles then, which would allow the community to learn more from our experiences. And finally, there's just so much collective trauma that I see in communities, in my communities, that I notice my community members feel the need to be resilient, to learn coping methods, and just move forward in the face of perpetual injustice. Native Hawaiian and other indigenous communities understand this best. It goes down to land and the constant perpetuity of land theft. And yet so many people in the legal system or the government have not experienced similar types of racial, gender, sexuality, or class-based trauma. So the people making law and enforcing the law and interpreting the law don't get our experiences. So a critical part of inclusion and acceptance is elevating people who share the lived experiences with our communities into leadership roles.
Another question that has come up is how class imbalances play a role in the LGBTQIA community. So one of the questions that came up is there any effect that poverty has on the community? And how can we utilize legal resources to address this issue?
I believe in looking to the most marginalized subcommunities of the communities I seek to do work with and to align my work with what they need. And for me, that looks like supporting the rights of people in prison and working to find alternatives to incarceration. I think often prison law is poverty law, just like housing law is and other forms of social services. That's a critical part of building the queer community that I want to be part of. And so poverty law, I think, is multifaceted. But when you're thinking intersectionally, it doesn't necessarily look like taking on cases that say LGBTQ in the summary or case description. It will look like robust welfare policies, increasing affordable housing, securing public health as a right, and remembering that LGBTQ people form parts of each class stratification in society. So we need to keep the focus on the issues affecting all poor people, and in doing so, we will support queer poor people. There are queer poor people, queer criminal defendants, queer injection drug users. Focusing on LGBTQ family issues, which is where a lot of the mainstream LGBTQ movement focuses, might inadvertently or perhaps purposefully provide support for only queer upper middle class people. But if you look at people in prison, for instance, as of 2020, 4,890 trans people in state prisons across 45 states and the District of Columbia. Only 15 of them, this is from NBC, only 15 of them were reported as housed according to their gender. In 2021, there were 1,200 trans people in federal prison. And in 2012, the DOJ found that in federal prisons, 40% of trans prisoners have been sexually assaulted, 10 times the rate of the general prison population. Trans people are strip searched and harassed at higher rates, forced to conform to hair and clothing appearances that don't align with their gender, and denied necessary medical care. So these issues would be somewhat alleviated if we focused on poverty issues and prison issues for everyone. But I think it is important to look at the intersections of trans people in such circumstances.
I wanted to next ask one of the questions that we got in our Q&A, and it says, what do you love about being queer, and how do you stay proud in this profession?
I was sharing with my fellow panelists that I did a panel presentation a week ago for law school in Kansas, and these were similar questions that came up. And I will say this, as far as being in the teaching profession, I remember when I first started, I guess about 20 years ago, almost maybe 18 years ago, I was asked to identify, up front, and having come from private practice, where again, in practicing in St. Louis in the middle of the country, it was a much trickier time, even in the 90s. So when I got into teaching and was asked to do that, at first you're like, wow, like this is something I'd never experienced before. But once I did, what I will say is as people already know, as many of you already know, being younger than me, being yourself and being accessible to people helps those who are still trying to figure themselves out. And especially the last law school I was at, lots of students who maybe didn't feel comfortable, again, being back in the middle of the country, knowing that I had identified and knowing that I was open to speaking with them, could come and talk about it and talk about their struggles and how they were thinking about the profession and everything. So I again, kind of us forgetting that we can model the behavior that we want the community to model, and give that kind of support. So I would say this, for me, that's been the most rewarding part of, being out, so to speak, and being genuine to who I am. And that I've, without even thinking about it, have helped a lot of students along the way, just to identify with someone, because even legal academia is probably not as well represented as people might assume that it is. Right? Depends on the school. So,
thank you. Another question I was hoping to hear more about was your experience in applying for legal jobs in your, in your professional career. We had a discussion earlier before we started regarding, disclosing LGBTQ status in applications. Is disclosure something that employers are looking for? Does that kind of serve as a negative? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I think it's a tough question. I think Dee's already kind of unfortunately shown us that it still can be an issue. And that may sound like a bit of a naive answer. And I don't mean it to sound that way, but I think, and I was asked this question last week, right? Obviously, I think once again, everyone has their way, their time and their way of dealing with whoever they are. And I think you have to feel comfortable with yourself at that point to be willing to identify and say, hey, if I can't be accepted for who I am, then this is not a place I want to work. And clearly I would say to you that that's where I've been, maybe the last 20 or so years, but I wasn't years ago, in part because there were consequences to it. And there still are, don't get me wrong, but I don't think there's a one size fits all answer. And I do think, so one of the questions that came up last week was, and one of the panelists said, what if there might be someone who may have taken Dee's experience, for instance, with the judge and said, what, I can live with that for a year, knowing that I'll use that as a launching pad to move on. And I think, I would assume all of us on the panel would say, that no one should be judged for their choices and everyone should be supported for the path they're trying to take. And sometimes for some people, it is about when you get to a certain point, you can then finally be and make those choices that you have. Or you decide you're going to make those choices up front and proceed that way too. So I do think it's hard to make that a bright line rule, but I would say, go back to the original question, maybe that was asked and that Dee answered so eloquently. Knowing you have allies and support in the community at large, but also the community of lawyers and your friends in the profession. Weigh on them and use them as support and maybe even as a guidepost along the way. So
I think hopefully the legal profession is changing. I don't want to say any more details about this judge, but he was on the older end of the judges I applied to. I've come out, I guess, in every application I've submitted since applying to colleges, and I've been able to live my dream career. It's just a matter of finding the right fit. I'm lucky to work for a judge now who gendered me properly in my interview and who tries every day to gender me properly and apologizes when he makes a mistake. Trying is really key. And so if, I shared a story when we were talking earlier about an advisor who recommended when applying to the United Nations not to sound like I'm too radical by talking about my gender or using mix in my resume or using D even in my resume because it's not my legal name. And I just thought, if that's really the best advice you can give me about applying to the United Nations, I'm just not going to apply. And so I didn't. It was one of the dream jobs I had going to law school, and I just didn't apply. I found a movement lawyering local South Africa organization, Lawyers for Human Rights, and worked for their gender equality program and absolutely loved it. So I think you have to know your needs and boundaries. And for me, a big boundary is I need to have the pronouns used that I'm requesting. If you can't give me that, then you clearly just don't respect me. And a big need is having queer affirming workspaces instead of just that low hanging fruit, like baseline floor of using my pronoun. I want to work in beautiful queer spaces where I can show up and twirl in the office if I wanted to. And so I've done that in many spaces I've worked in, and sang to myself, right? Like, we need to be able to live our queer utopias now. I believe in kind of a Plato's cave theory of queerness and gender and sexuality. And I've made it to a certain extent. There are always turns in this labyrinth. But like, I've made it outside the cave in my sexuality and gender, at least, even if not in other ways. Like, I don't want to go back in the cave. I don't want to look at the shadows. There's butterflies and trees to dance between and a sun shining down. Let me live in the sunshine. And that's what I bring to every space that I enter. So I would hope to work in spaces that actually value my sunshine.
Dee, you raised an important point in not living in the shadows and moving forward and being open and allowing the next generation that opportunity. So moving on in that sense, what is an issue currently in this community that many people are facing, but that others may not be aware of? And how can we open it up so that we can provide resources and community building and knowledge of just these issues?
I think right now in the LGBT legal world, you have kind of the formal legal equality movement is where we started. And in some of the internships I was able to work on at GLAD, I worked on the trans discrimination from the military ban. At the ACLU, I was able to work on the Title VII case for trans people in employment discrimination, RG funeral homes. And I think what we see is really, I have this book next to me because I didn't want to forget to mention it, From the Closet to the Altar by Michael Klarman, just really describes what is happening. Courts, Backlash, and the Struggle for Same-Sex Marriage is the subtitle of the book. And right now we're seeing the backlash to trans rights in different policies being passed at the state level. And Kim Davis just recently, who refused to sign marriage certificates after Obergefell for same-sex couples, which was, granting the right of same-sex marriage, that instantly having the clerk say, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to follow the clearly established law. She was denied qualified immunity because it was so clearly established. It was literally a Supreme Court opinion that just came out. And she's now been found at summary judgment as violating constitutional rights. This is happening to trans students, the parents of trans students. It's happening in trans healthcare issues. This is all defensive, and it's sad that we have to be in the defensive because there's all this proactive, positive litigation that also needs to be brought forward. The things I listed before about prisons, housing, public health, expanding the because of sex interpretation that we got from the Title VII cases into other civil rights statutes. That's positive litigation that's now being curtailed or slowed because of the defensive that the ACLU has been put into. And so I think it's just, constantly going to be this back and forth because of the culture wars, we could call it. But I think Michael Klarman's thesis takes the culture wars concept and actually expands it. So if anyone's really interested in this and seeing what's probably going to be our lifetimes, if not at least the next 30 years, I'd recommend that book and just think about how you'd apply it to what's happening right now.
I was curious if either of you might have, any advice you might want to give to LGBTQ law students or future law students or, the next generation of law students, especially in a time where our rights are coming under attack because of these, culture wars and, this backlash to, our very existence. It can seem very, I think, frightening, seeing what's happening. But just curious if anyone has any advice they might want to give the next generation.
I do think that the one area the law has really failed is in the trans area and gender expression and gender identification. We were making progress, and then obviously we had a certain president that reversed a lot of that and actually did some damage. And it's really interesting for me because when I first came out, the biggest issue was AIDS. And although some pharmaceutical progress had happened by that point, there were still a lot of people dying. And so the community was really rallied around that. And one of the most fun things I've written as a law professor was right before I came here to Hawaii, two of my friends did a symposium on Loving versus Virginia and its 50-year celebration of its 50-year decision to end, the ban on interracial marriage. And they asked me to do an LGBT perspective on it and what that meant to the community. And so I wrote an essay about, where I was even how many years prior to that, where, marriage and everything was so far out of anyone's imagination. But sure enough, things happen. I am concerned, I think, as Kaliko and Dee have said about, the backtracking that we're seeing. But I will say that I balance all that with well, one, I'm older, but two, I have a 15-year-old son, 15 and a half year old. His maturity on these issues just blows me away. And in fact, when it comes to the proper use of terms, right? I fully admit, right, not being as up to date on all of the different ways people identify. Boy, he'll explain it to me lickety split, right, and knows it as if it's second language to him. I mean, the first primary language, not second language. Just already in high school, he has folks who are identifying, right, and with respect to gender or to sexuality, whatever the case may be. And it's really of no consequence to him from the perspective of, this is the way the world is. He sees it very much as this is the way it is. And these are people, this is who they are. And he accepts it for what it is. So I look at that. I know it sounds a little Pollyannish, which I'm typically not, by the way. But I do look at that and I say, wow, right? If that can really be the folks that are coming up, then we just got to hopefully let some of these, unfortunately, not some of them are not so old white men. DeSantis isn't that young. I mean, that old, but we got to let some of these old white men kind of drift off and hope that the people that are rising up to take their place are going to be the people who have been raised with a much more open perspective, and that things will go back to a more positive trajectory as opposed to backwards. But I know that sounds a little bit hopeful, overly hopeful, but I don't think it does any good to not hope and say continue to educate and really, it starts with our kids. That's where we can really make the difference, I think. And I'm so heartened by the fact. I mean, he's been playing volleyball this past year, and it's a freshman. There's an out kid on the team. There's, as if it was no big deal whatsoever, and that's really heartening. That was never the case when I was young and at his age. So I say that as a word of hope that I do think the younger people coming behind us, and look at some who are on the panel already, are showing us that I do think we're in much better position for the future than certainly I felt 20, 30 years ago.
So this was a question about advice, but then Tapu has this great question here about how we get queer folks into this space and how we incentivize, inspire, and support people. And then there were amazing questions that the Lambda students gave us beforehand. And I just want to share what I prepared. I think some stresses that we experience and some advice in terms of, with this backlash, with everything coming at the queer community, trans community, trauma, mental health issues that stem from that trauma, whether that's PTSD, anxiety, or depression, poverty because people aren't hiring us, houselessness, and maybe even in shelters. There's actually a lot of discrimination against queer people in shelters, lack of access to community, whether, based on where you are, to the point of Stephanie Thompson, that some of this inclusivity might be specific to Hawaii, an inability to express one's identity freely or at work or at home, freely at work or at home. That's a lot, right? We face a lot just being openly queer or not openly queer. And so I think in terms of what advice I could possibly give, given everyone's individual experiences with the state of the world, show up as your best possible self. Sometimes that means you can bang out a memo at work in a few hours, and other times it means asking for a mental health day. Rest and take real vacation days when you need to, and turn your phone off when you do. Remember that we're all multifaceted people. Lawyer is not an identity, but a role. And I have come closer to thinking the social constructions of my identities are all constraints of the mind. I'm me. So I should not let the identification with the LGBT community membership or the disavowal of straight community membership define me or prevent me from building the life I want. I want to disagree with the LGBT mainstream when I think they're wrong, and build collaborations across the aisle politically, across these supposedly rigid community boundaries, because I think intergroup dialogue and solidarity is key. We can't handle all of the onslaught against our community if we don't work with straight people. And so we do need allies, I think. And the allies need to center our experiences in the work that they do. in the donor money that they give to the organizations that we want to work with. And where we're hired, we can convince, neutral organizations, neutral state civil rights offices to bring cases that center our experiences and to sign on to amicus briefs that center our experiences. I'll stop there.
And I think that it is important to bring awareness to the legal policies, to legislation that is brought by anti-LGBTQIA organizations, and the importance it is to mobilize and have support for legislation that is out there supporting our community. And one of the questions that we had was that the law can often seem esoteric or daunting to community members, and what are opportunities for LGBTQIA people that are in non-legal professions to support policy or to make changes in the legal realm?
So this is a big question, and I've asked Thaddeus. I'm sad that he can't just turn on a camera and talk. But I've asked him, because of the work that he does in Hawaii, if he can type some ideas into the chat. With my little corner of movement lawyering, I'll speak from personal experience. Something that people can do, specifically non-legal professionals, is be a pen pal for people in prison. Black and Pink is an LGBTQ pen pal network, and they pair you with someone on the inside, and you can just talk to them. And often when correction officials know that someone has a pen pal, they might harass them less because they know that someone is thinking about them from the outside. So that's just one small non-law and policy action, but actually just personal and community building action that non-lawyers can do. Tons of policy action that people can do as well.
This is a little bit aside, but I will say that my husband's a project manager and has worked in mostly the financial institutions industry, so to speak, right? And all of those companies have had, some sort of, work group, but I remember one in particular did call it kind of an ally type of, and so it wasn't just LGBT members of the company itself, but it was also allies. And so just to kind of reinforce, what Dee is saying, absolutely, this change cannot come just it is about educating and role modeling and having those allies that support you, right? And I think that's important in any number of areas besides even just what we're talking about here, right? Just even some of the work I've been doing recently on wealth inequality and how our systems add to this exponentially and with a adverse racial effect. I think one of the things we've lost in the discussion, right, which Trump really seemed to seize on, right, is when we're looking at this huge wealth disparity with absolute issues of poverty, and we're starting to again segment off into differences based on race and differences based on ethnicity, anything you can think of, right? And actually we need to get back to looking at it as a class issue, and that those poor, the people that Trump appealed to, right, the white workers who felt they were abandoned because of the discussions of the left, whatever. But we're only going to really make progress on systematic issues is if people who are similarly situated can try to work together and realize it's an issue that affects everyone. And that's hard to do. I'm not saying that's the easy way to do it, but I think Dee's comment is absolutely on point. I think it's got to be bigger than just just us. It's got to be those who are also understanding that this is having an effect and that they care about it and that they're allies.
There's a question that I really want to answer and hear Kaliko and Nick's answers to as well, about how our LGBTQ identity has evolved over the legal profession. I'm really curious to know, because as someone who is doing LGBT activism with my career, I think it's very different from those who go into non-purely like LGBT mainstream jobs. I'll share mine after I hear from the others.
like I said, I think maybe before, if it wasn't clear, I just came out at a time and worked in the profession, especially because I was in DC, right, where you're going back to, which was a great place to be. And then I went back to the Midwest for private practice, where I was for 7 years in 2 different law firms, big law firms. And one law firm, the first law firm I was at actually was fairly progressive for the middle of the country at the time. And I would say I would keep Chicago out of that. Chicago is big enough that it's more like New York. But and then I moved law firms in part because I wanted to move with this partner who had recruited me, and went to a place that actually was far worse. Male dominated, straight male dominated. So also lots of hypocrisy about it. There's no way I could be completely out. Although I didn't lie about it either, right? So, and so it, I learned, I kept things kind of segmented in boxes, which is not at all the way I would ever advise someone to live their life. But, you did what you did at the time. And I did accomplish some change by not overly pushing the issue. I found later on from friends that stayed at the firm after I'd left. But then I went into academia, and obviously academia was different, especially my first law school. But I will tell you that I'm in Hawaii and teaching in Hawaii because where I was in the Midwest, that particular school, just the way it was not a supportive environment. And I was very honest with them. They knew I was out. I had a partner. We weren't legally married at the time, and we had an adopted son. There was absolutely nothing, and it was refreshing to be able to do that. And I thought that was okay, and it ended up that it wasn't. And you kind of let it be. And I had someone else who taught in my area, and we had what I would say was a détente for 6 years. And then it got to the point over other issues where I could just no longer stay. It's kind of what Cleke was saying. You definitely evolve, and you're like, okay, enough of this. And I would slip into old habits of thinking, well, this is really not anything to do with me being gay. But then comments would come out in disagreements, right? And I was in controversial things like planning and assessment of things that, old-time faculty don't want to deal with, where words like overly sensitive and thin-skinned and, all these kinds of, microaggression type things come out, and you're like, oh, okay, so I guess it is. So I'd like to tell you that, you're on a path and you think that it's good, and then you make a turn, and then it's like, wow, okay, this is not good. But I guess the best part about it is that I decided, I don't have to stay here, and I'm not going to do that anymore. This is not, I'm not going backwards anymore. And I chose this job. Just happened to open up. Thought it was a long shot, to be honest with you, but decided to interview. And once again, though, completely open and honest about who I was and what my family was. And of course, that was greatly embraced by this school. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question in that long dialogue, but you do learn, and and if you are slower to get to some of the places that maybe other people seem to be much more resolute on sooner than you, give yourself that break and know that there's always change that's possible, right? And I'm much later to it, quite honestly, but I think it's the only way, I think, once you are happy in your life, to do that. And then I wrote about it. So in hopes that would, also make some change occur. So that's the best you can do. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah. How can we find your writing? Because I would love to read what you wrote about.
Yeah. I mean, so the writing I did was actually with, it actually involved a colleague of mine, brilliant woman. And what finally was the death knell at my prior law school was that, let's just say that I've been quoted in the newspaper because there was all kinds of ugly stuff that was leaked over a disagreement and all that stuff. It was not a great place. But I stood up for a colleague of mine, a female colleague, who I just thought was being unbelievably harassed on 2 different occasions in meetings. And that ended up being the beginning of the end for me, from the perspective of a group of people. So we ended up writing, so it was less on the gay piece, although we did talk about the gay issue. We wrote on disruptive leadership. And, you know, and how disruptive leadership, especially in still a fairly conservative environment, which is law schools. I mean, Hawaii is definitely different, but there's a lot of law schools out there that are still not, you know, kind of old school in their thinking. And the perils of deciding to be disruptive. But it was fun to write, and it was maybe not so well received by others. But you know, we've gotten some comments back that other law schools are using it in training and other things. And so, you know, as I'm sure Dean and Kaliko would say, sometimes change has its consequences, right? But if you're doing what you think is right, it's still the best thing you can do.
Thank you.
So anyway, I'm glad to make, yeah, if you, well, if you look me up, you'll see, I think if you go even just to my faculty webpage, you'll see where that is. So, but, you know, for what it's worth, I don't know that I would have written that, you know, 25 years ago, right? So again, to go back to our theme of, you know, everyone evolves in their own time, and go with that.
Yeah, I think that's a nice, I'll just finish with this, which is like the next generation having, I was born in 1993. I realized at 14, basically at puberty, that I was queer, and I instantly came out to my entire school, and eventually to my mom and dad. Mom's on the call actually, and some aunts, and a teacher from 7th grade. Hi everyone. And I applied to law school as a gay man in 2014 because that's what I was. And then I became non-binary and started using they, them pronouns after applying. I didn't know how the law school was going to handle that when I arrived. They handled it fine, well enough. There were some hurdles. Harvard did not allow me to change my email's name for a very long time, even though I know that that's a very easy thing to do. It's changed now. Professors were kind of told by the dean of students to, you know, that I was coming into the classroom and to try to use they, them pronouns, and to try to use first names or something gender neutral when speaking to everyone in the classroom, or to use mix. And most of the professors I had complied. I'd say all of them complied in different ways. Some bobbled, but it worked. I played with she or they pronouns at a public interest conference at Yale Law School called Reb Law, but it didn't feel right. But I was able to kind of allow myself to explore that trans femininity, and I don't think I was trying to figure out if I was a trans woman, and I don't think I was. And that was, again, in the legal world, right? I was doing that in a law school conference. These are places and spaces where we're able to play, if you're a nerd like me, at least. And I started to identify as a fairy after working as a research assistant to a professor, Anna Lvovsky, who just published Vice Patrol, Cops, Courts, and the Struggle Over Urban Gay Life Before Stonewall. Also highly recommend that book. She's a historian, got a JD PhD. I was reading dozens of state liquor authority decisions from the 1920s through 1960s when bars were policed for catering to patrons who looked gay, which the police would confirm as expert witnesses. Fairies were a specific group in that era. They were different from gay men, and they were different from queer women, and they were different from trans women. They were fairies. They were not just effeminate men, but they skated across the gender spectrum freely at will and could flirt with gender roles in a non-binary way that others would gawk at or adore. They were not necessarily the entertainers on stage like drag queens, but they were a fixture of some of these spaces. And I feel like as doing this research and working in these really archives that my professor had collected, I got a glimpse of precisely how I move through the world, and both in my social life and my activist life and in the law and the law school classroom and in the court. Like, I am a fairy. It just clicked. And so that's an invitation to everyone on this call to think about the things that we're researching and reading as an anthropology major, as an undergrad. So maybe that shows, right? Like, we should always be thinking about our in a self-reflexive dialogue with what we're researching. The law makes it difficult, but it's not impossible. And to not think that your identity is fixed, because we're still growing and we can grow for the rest of our lives and change for the rest of our lives. I don't know how my queer identity will evolve for the rest of my time in the legal profession, but I'm really excited to see.
I don't think there could be a better way to end this program. I wanted to thank our wonderful panelists for all their different experiences and insights. We are so honored that you have all been able to join us, and we are really appreciative. We also wanted to thank the Hawaiʻi LGBT Legacy Foundation and also Lambda for putting together this event. And we know that some of the topics may have been difficult, so if anyone needs any resources, they are out there. Our law school has our counseling program, and we can also provide links to community resources. And we just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And this will be available on YouTube at the Hawaiʻi LGBT Legacy Foundation YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night.